super fun stuff today, which is constitutions. So essentially, you've decided to become a democracy, or maybe you're not, and you want to build yourself a constitution. You want to design how you want government to work. What are the factors that are put into place that you need to consider in building your constitution and building your government? So this is the Designing a Government 101. And I like to call it Constitutions, the Blueprint of Democracy. All right, so let's go through some of the basics before we talk about the different branches and what are the choices that you're going to have to make. So first of all, what exactly do constitutions do? So we talked a bit when we were talking about theories of the state about a social contract, the idea that human beings give up some of their power, some of their freedoms to the state in order to preserve their freedoms, not so that they don't get all of their things stolen on them or they don't get killed. So essentially, this social contract means that the people are giving up some of their freedoms in exchange for protections or, freedom to actually do things without getting killed. So this social contract then limits the use of power by the government to the benefit the citizens in exchange for his or her allegiance and support. So you can either have a codified or a written constitution or an uncodified or unwritten constitution. Probably pretty clear what the difference is. So a codified constitution is like the United States. There's a written constitution that you can go and read. Uncodified is an unwritten constitution. So for example, in the UK, there is no real constitution that you can just kind of look up and read. So why have it written versus unwritten? Largely, it's just historical circumstances. Most new democracies today will actually write down a constitution. And even uncodified constitutions can have documents associated with it. So like the Magna Carta, or in Canada, we have the British North America Act, the Canada Act, the Constitution Act, the Charter. So there's usually something written down, but it's not like in the United States where there's a specific written down constitution. So what do you put in a constitution? You'll usually put your key values. What are some of the things that you want to uphold in this state? And then how those values are reflected in how government is designed and how that's going to get enforced. So it'll have things like, what is going to be the rule of law? What are the rights of citizens? How do we deal with issues of diversity? How do we design government? And so that's the main focus for today. So let's go back. So an example of building a constitution relatively recently would be the example of South Africa. So the end of apartheid meant we need a new constitution. So what they did is they started off with an interim constitution with 34 key principles. So things like we want to have a unitary state. We'll talk about what that means in a second. With common citizenship, everyone gets the same sort of citizenship. We want to have racial and gender equality. We want constitutional supremacy. So there's nothing above the Constitution. And so what they did is they adopted an interim constitution, and then they took about 3 years or so to build a new constitution. And in 96, they presented this new constitution. The first draft was actually rejected by the Constitutional Court because it didn't live up to those initial principles, specifically regarding the issue of centralization. So how much power our provincial government's going to have versus a federal government. But we want a unitary state, so technically these provincial governments shouldn't have too much power. So there's a lot of debate and discussion. So constitutions are constantly being updated. After the Arab Spring, Egypt built a new constitution. Thailand just has a new constitution coming in. So this isn't just something that happened way back in the day when the United States was drafting its constitution. It's something that is continually happening as countries and new democracies and countries changing regimes, whether that be to democracy or from democracy, are continually changing and updating their constitutions to reflect what these new values are. So I'm going to send you to a couple videos. One that I think you should watch just because it's very cool. It's from back in 96 when the South African Constitution was passed. And then there's another longer one. So it's about 20 minutes long, so you don't necessarily have to watch the entire thing, but it's really good background on how South Africa got to the point where they were building a new constitution. So take a look at that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the major building blocks. We talk about 3 different branches of government. Hopefully you covered this in POE 205, that there are 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. So now we have a bunch of decisions that we need to make. We're building this constitution. And what is our executive, legislative, and judicial branches going to look like? All right, so executive branch is essentially, the major question is, who's going to be in charge? Is it a prime minister? Is it a president? What's that going to look like? And so you have kind of two main options, a presidential system or a parliamentary system, and then the mixed option in between. So let's look at these options, talk about some of the pros and cons of each of these systems. So we'll start with the presidential system. Good example is the United States. It's one that we kind of probably know really well. So the key characteristic here is that the executive and the legislative branches are separate and both elected. So how they're created and how they survive is completely separate. And so they're completely different. So you can see in this diagram right here, the people are electing the president, and they're also electing the legislature, and never the two shall meet. So they're completely separate. So the president is usually elected by some sort of popular vote or some sort of intermediate institution that carries out this popular preference. So we see that with the Electoral College in the United States, where it's not actually popular vote, but it's through the Electoral College. A lot of places it is direct head of state, direct election by whoever gets the most votes. Sometimes it can be multi-round though, where you have to make sure that you have 50% of the votes. But we'll talk about that when we talk about electoral systems later. Usually the presidential's term, or it does have to be kind of a fixed term, and there's no provision for getting rid of them unless you want to impeach them. So it means that they're really not required to rely on the legislature for their survival. And they're not really accountable to the legislature in any way because they're completely separate. So usually a cabinet or ministers are directly appointed by the president, and that the president can have some role in lawmaking, but that they do not have direct influence on the legislature. All right, so what are the pros and cons then of having this presidential system? So the first is that the president gets a direct mandate from the government, from the people. So citizens get to choose their head of government themselves. And it's not like in a parliamentary system where, who really chose Justin Trudeau, for example, our prime minister. We'll talk about that in a second. But it provides citizens with a really direct mechanism to hold the executive accountable and to say, I have chosen this particular president. Another strength is that there's a fixed term in office, so it's really predictable. We know that, you have Trump for 4 years, and then we'll see what happens, that they can maybe be able to run again, but that you have a specific term, whereas it's less common with parliamentary systems, especially because of the way that the leader stays in power. Although we sometimes do have fixed election dates and stuff, but anyway, that's another discussion. There's also separation of powers. So there's two structures that are completely separated that can check each other. And that the legislative branch, for example, can really provide opposition to the president without being worried about the entire government collapsing because they have direct legitimacy from the people, and vice versa. The president can be opposed to the legislature and kind of hold them accountable, hold them check their power, knowing that they're not responsible to the legislature for their power. What are the challenges of a presidential system? The first is this tendency towards authoritarianism. It's very much a winner takes all. You're either president or you're not. And so oftentimes if there's thin margins between winners and losers, there can be some issues with opposition feeling completely left out. It can also result in political gridlock because you rely on two different branches that are not related to each other at all. It can be really hard to get things done. The legislature can decide something and the president can go and veto it. Or the president can say, hey, we should do this thing, but the legislature doesn't pass it. So you can see that in the United States where, there's always issues of political gridlock, of not being able to get things done. And that's largely because of the separation of powers that happen in a presidential system. So what are all our alternatives then? If we don't want a presidential system, well, of course, we can go to a parliamentary system like we have here in Canada. So essentially, in this case, the technical definition for it would be that the executive is hierarchically subordinated to the legislature. So the executive, so the prime minister, they are depending on the legislature for their survival. So essentially, what happens is the head of government is elected by the legislature, or in our case, it's the leader of the party with the most amount of support in the legislature, the most amount of seats, and that this head of state is very much responsible to this legislature and held accountable. So we talk about responsible government in Canada, the idea that the prime minister needs to keep support of the House, and when that doesn't happen, when the legislature does not agree anymore, or not support the head of government anymore, the prime minister, they can just get rid of them. They can say, you know what, we don't have confidence, we're going to pick somebody else, or we're going to go have a new election. So generally in this sort of parliamentary system, the head of state then is some sort of ceremonial job. So it could be a president that is ceremonial, more of a ceremonial role, or a monarch like we have in Canada. And so essentially here what you see is that the people are electing a legislature, which then elects and decides on their executive branch. So the executive branch and the legislative branch are tied together. They have to exist in support of each other. All right, so what are the pros and cons then of a parliamentary system? So some of the benefits is that a parliamentary system often can allow for more inclusive government, especially if there's a divided society where there's lots of different interests and lots of different parties, especially if you get a proportional representation electoral system, which we'll talk about in a future class. But essentially, you can have more parties involved in the legislature and therefore in choosing the head of government. And that larger amount of involvement can be very, very useful, especially when societies are divided. It's pretty flexible, so the head of government can get removed at any time if their if their legislature does not still support them. So in Canada, it's tricky because our leader of the party is chosen not by the caucus or not by the members of the party that are actually legislators, but they're chosen by the kind of rank and file members of the party. So Justin Trudeau couldn't get dismissed just based on caucus or all the Liberal members of Parliament saying we don't want them anymore. But in a lot of countries, like UK and Australia, that's how they choose a leader. Is the caucus chooses who they want to lead them, and so that means that if this prime minister or this leader gets out of control or is starting to do weird things that they don't support, they can just say, okay, we're just going to pick somebody else. So it can be much more flexible in that sense. It can be quicker to get stuff done because there's no veto from the executive, because the executive is necessarily part of the legislative branch. So like you can see where an American president can veto a new law, and even though the legislative branch wants something to go through, the president can veto it. Whereas this doesn't really happen in a parliamentary system because the executive branch is they're in the parliament, they're in the legislature, and they are moving legislation forward through this legislative function. Some cons of parliamentary government. Instability. So government can collapse at pretty much any time. There's at any point in time, members could decide, even in a majority government, if they all decided to jump ship, they could bring down the government very easily. So it's very unstable, especially if you don't have a majority government like we tend to have in Canada. In a lot of countries where there's a lot more parties and there's more coalition governments, things could fall apart really at any moment in time. And then the other thing is that, this particular head of government gets very powerful. They're in charge of the legislative and the executive branch. And there's really no separation of powers. We say we have in Canada a fused legislative and executive branch. And, the government might not be able to do everything they want, the government might be able to push things through a lot easier. And that can be a problem, though, if it's not, if things aren't thought through as well as they should be, for example. So there's pros and cons to the parliamentary system as well. Now, of course, like every good political concept, there's also a mixture between the two. So a mixed system or semi-presidential system is essentially a dual executive. So there's this head of state, president, which is elected, but then is involved in the selection process of the head of government. So the president, as I mentioned, is usually elected head of state by popular vote, and neither the president nor the legislature is in full control of choosing or removing the prime minister. So the Prime Minister is accountable to Parliament through the non-confidence, just like we had in the parliamentary system. But then the President also possesses executive powers. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds and the worst of both worlds all at once, which leads to this issue of pros and cons of a mixed system. So it can be very inclusive, and there's a degree of power sharing between opposing forces. So like one party can occupy the presidency and another party can occupy the head of government or premiership, and they both have a stake in the system. However, it can also result in stalemate, especially if the prime minister and the president are from different parties. Then there's this question of who's really the legitimate authority and who actually speaks on behalf of the people. And it can really just cause for some stalemate and issues with actually figuring out who is in power. So France is a semi-presidential system. If we give Canada as an example of parliamentary and US as presidential, France would be an example of a mixed system. All right, so so the main questions, let's just go back here. Oops, let's move up. Is, do we want parliamentary, presidential, or semi-presidential, or mixed system? And really the question is, who's the head of state, how are they selected, and who's the head of government, and how are they selected? So those are some of your options. So let's move to the next branch, which is the legislative branch of government. So there's a few questions that we need to ask about legislative branch. First of all, how many houses do we want? So we know in Canada we have a bicameral legislature, meaning we have two houses, bicameral, so two houses. Unicameral means you have one house. So, most provincial government, I wonder if all provincial government, I think all provincial governments now. I'll have to check that. All provincial governments now have just a unicameral house, one house. Yeah, there are no senates. So anyway, but we know that federally in Canada we have a House of Commons and a Senate. So you can have two houses, you can have one house. So why would you want two houses versus one house versus three houses? I don't know if there's any with three houses. I'll have to look that up too. All right. So bicameral legislatures can be useful because they're more flexible. You can have both a house that has representation by population, like our House of Commons, and then regional representation, kind of like our Senate. That's really the idea in the United States, is that the Congress, the House of Representatives, is based completely on population, whereas everybody gets the same amount of senators. So it's based on every state gets the same amount of senators. So it's very much providing state representation. So it can be much more flexible in that way. You can make sure that you're not having really hastily drafted laws, because you need to have two houses support it. So it can kind of slow things down, which can be a good thing. More deliberation, more review. It can avoid simple just tyranny of the majority. So, one house decides, great, we have a majority, push something through. Sometimes you have to pause and think about, is what the majority thinks always necessarily the best idea. It can provide, when power is more divided in a bicameral system, lobbyists need to focus on many different legislators and find out support from a lot of different people, and so that can help kind of temper the influence of lobbyists. But it can also mean that there's many more points of access to power. Your other option then is a unicameral legislature, so one house. And that can be useful because it provides greater accountability, because it's not like you can blame the other house for not getting something passed. You're it, so you are responsible for what passes and what doesn't pass. It can be much more efficient. Of course, the problem with that is that you can have the tyranny of the majority. It can be just easier to push something through that needs to get done right away without having to worry about a second house. It's really easy to know who's responsible because there are fewer legislators, and you really know who's to blame because there's only one house. And because it can be transparent, it can reduce the influence of lobbyists as well. So there's pros and cons to having two houses, having one house. So that's one decision that needs to get made. Um, the next decision that needs to get made is, who does each house represent? So in Canada and the US, it's regional interests. So our senates are based on providing regional representation, ideally. Whereas in Australia, what they use for the Senate is to make up for what's lacks in proportionality in their electoral system. So they have a proportional representation system in their Senate. So you have to decide, who's going to be representing who. The next thing you need to choose is how are members of these houses going to be chosen, and that's the electoral systems debate. We're not really going to get there. We're not really going to go there today, though, because we have a whole lecture on that. This one's good typo here. So how will houses in the executive legislate? So what's going to be the balance of power between the different houses and the executive? And then we have to also consider the issue of federalism when you're talking about your legislative branch. So do we have a unitary government or a federal government? So a unitary government means where you have one central government controls all of it. So you might give out power to municipal or regional governments, but you always have that right to take it back. Whereas in a federal system, actually it's a relatively recent phenomenon. The United States was the first. Canada is an example of one as well, where states or provinces retain power in their jurisdictions, and then federal government is designed at least to take care of the interstate issues, things like money, national defense, those sorts of things. And so federalism essentially means that there's two levels of government, each with their own sovereign responsibilities. Whereas in a unitary system of government, even if there are multiple levels of government, they don't have constitutionally prescribed powers that can't get taken away. And so there's also this consideration of, okay, do we want one level of legislatures or do we want multiple levels of legislatures? And if we have subnational legislatures, what kind of powers do they have? Are they constitutionally prescribed or not? Okay. So that's another issue we need to consider when we talk about building our legislative branch is kind of what powers will subunits have if they exist. All right, so the last branch of government then that we need to design is our judicial branch. So essentially, judicial branch is traditionally the branch of government that is responsible for interpreting the law rather than creating the law. And the idea is that they're going to settle disputes and administer justice by looking at specific cases. And so essentially, it's this idea of, are we fulfilling our Constitution or not? Sometimes there's extra powers that exist in constitutions. So in addition to reviewing the constitutionality of laws, they might be involved in advising governments. So we see in Canada issues with the reference cases, so where the government will reference something to the Supreme Court and say, hey, are we allowed to do this or not? So sometimes the judiciary can have that role as well. They can be involved in amending the Constitution. They can be involved in having some powers if there's a state of emergency, especially in a presidential system. They might be involved in an impeachment process if we really have to get rid of a president. And actually, very cool, a lot of, especially in South America, actually, a lot of countries, not a lot of them, but some countries have electoral tribunals. So they allow the judiciary to be involved in the administration of elections because obviously you may not want the legislature or the executive to be running elections because they're fighting in the elections. So there's also special electoral courts, which is very cool. So some of the questions you're going to have to ask is, okay, so how are we going to select our judges? Are they going to be appointed? Are they going to be elected? Who's doing that appointment? Is there going to be some sort of review from the judicial branch? We see a lot of debate in Canada and the US about whether there should be legislative branch review of the judiciary or justices, because it can turn into a spectacle, but then it can also provide some sense of elected accountability for unelected judges. So there's a whole area of debate there. The other questions you want to ask is, okay, so how long is their tenure? Do they have a cutoff age? Are there term limits? And should we have term limits? One could say that term limits are good because it means that you're only in for a certain amount of time. The other thing is if you put somebody in until they retire or die, then you know that they're completely impartial. They're not really beholden to anybody, because there really is no life after being, say, a Supreme Court justice, for example. And then how do you remove judges if they go off their rocker? Is it the legislative branch? Is it the judiciary branch? And there's obviously many, many potential dangers there, where, if you do allow a legislative branch to get rid of judges, then there's a potential for abuse and a potential for there to be, for the judicial branch to not remain as impartial as they should. So those are kind of the three main building blocks of any sort of democratic government. Actually, honestly, the building blocks of any government, even if they're not democratic. And that's some of the issues that you need to start thinking about when you are trying to build a constitution and essentially design or build a government. So we're going to stop that there, but I am going to go through Lynn's Perils of Presidentialism. So video number 2 is coming up next. So I will see you soon. If I can figure out how to get out of here. There we go.